Well, buenas tardes. I'm sorry I can't be there in person and you have to watch my gigantic head. Nonetheless, thank you very much for inviting me to present at this excellent conference on a topic that has the potential to contribute so much to the improvement of so many lives. Second chance, often called fresh start or discharge, is indeed an effective mechanism for producing those improvements and solving some of Europe's most pressing problems. I'll begin with a statistical note. The welfare-enhancing effects of second chance procedure were quantified in a fascinating paper by US economists at Harvard University and the Social Security Administration, who concluded that relief through a payment plan-based second chance procedure in the US called Chapter 13, which is very similar to European personal insolvency regimes, increased debtors' annual earnings by 25%, increased employment by more than 8%, and reduced 5-year mortality, death, by 30%, as compared to debtors who were not offered relief. This is an effective mechanism indeed. This new income and employment represents taxable revenue that would not exist and would not benefit tax authorities and society if the second chance discharge were not available. Taxes discharged in this procedure were doubtless far less than the taxes collected on new post-relief earnings. Moving quickly past that dry academic point, though, the second chance policy also has the surprising potential to alleviate the long-term European problem of population decline. Let me tell you the much more interesting true story of das erste Frankfurter Insolvenzbaby, the first Frankfurt insolvency baby. A young German couple visited a debt counselor in Frankfurt years ago. The pair were very beaten down, the debt counselor reported, as a huge debt hung over their heads. This debt plagued the young couple, especially because they wanted nothing more in life than to have a baby. But they had decided not to start a family for fear of burdening their child with their life of persecution by debt collectors. Luckily, the debt counselor was able to recommend the German personal insolvency procedure, which would offer the couple and their future child relief from their debts, a second chance, fresh start. The debt counselor explained that the young family could erase their unpaid debts by agreeing to give up a small portion of their income over several years, a period that recently was reduced in Germany to 3 years, but at the time was longer. But for low-income people like this young couple, the law would require them to give up substantially less than they had already been struggling to pay to creditors up to that point. The couple could hardly believe it. After a bit more conversation about that new law with the debt counselor, they began for the first time to smile, then to laugh, and finally, they smiled at each other and ran out of the office. 9 months later, a new baby arrived in Frankfurt. Das erste Frankfurter Insolvenzbaby. The debt counselor was quoted as exclaiming, "Without this counseling session, this child would never have been born. She is thus really a true insolvency baby." Second chance in the form of a fresh start discharge is thus not only a second chance at starting up a business and re-entering the consumer marketplace, it is a second chance to experience the joys of family and relieve young people of the heavy burdens of debt that prevent them from engaging fully in society at the most basic and essential levels, such as being parents and creating future generations of European consumers and entrepreneurs. In a similar vein, Europe needs not only more human babies, it needs more business babies in the form of entrepreneurial startups. The second chance discharge contributes significantly to this societal benefit as well. In a now famous empirical study, John Armour and Douglas Cumming of Oxford and York universities, respectively, concluded that the second chance discharge is an especially effective mechanism for supporting the creation of new business activity. Other researchers have found similar results. Armour and Cumming showed through careful data analysis that changes that make bankruptcy laws more forgiving are associated with increases in the self-employment rate. They also noted that these effects are consistently statistically significant and economically large. Entrepreneurs need to learn in the marketplace, not only in a classroom. And failure and a second chance are the essential aspects of this learning. A recent book called Range describes some of these learning processes. Among my favorite stories described include the Nike co-founder Phil Knight's entrepreneurial philosophy. His main goal for his new shoe company was to fail fast enough that he could apply what he was learning to his next venture. He made one short-term change after another, applying the lessons of failure as he went. This is exactly how an effective second chance policy works to foster and support entrepreneurship. We need to let people fail, learn from whatever caused that failure, either mistakes or general economic volatility or COVID, and get back on their feet quickly to move on to new ventures. If the painful lessons of failure are quickly followed by re-entry into the market, those lessons can be implemented in more successful business ventures and continued employment. In contrast, with ineffective, heavily restricted, or even absent second chance fresh start, which Armour and Cumming observed will consign the entrepreneur to the economic dustbin, which I, as an American, would call garbage can, producing far less serial entrepreneurship. These researchers concluded the policy implications are seemingly clear. Forgiving personal bankruptcy laws and ready access to limited liability offer significant policy instruments for enhancing entrepreneurial activity. Speaking of limited liability, business companies that have shielded entrepreneurs from personal liability for the past 150 years have almost literally built the Europe that we see today. The second chance issue is not particularly controversial in the company context. The notion of doing business behind a legal veil of limited liability was a controversial innovation in the 19th century, with the goal of encouraging risk-taking entrepreneurial activity, exactly the same goal of the second chance discharge. Not only major multinational corporations, but also ordinary small business people eventually were allowed to limit their personal risk in advance by limiting liability exposure and concentrating it on a pool of invested assets. This is the second chance discharge in a sense, as the company allows its owners to incur liabilities without bearing personal risk for life. Shielded behind their limited liability artificial entities, entrepreneurs are free to walk away from a failed venture and relaunch another, which, as Armour and Cumming point out, is the very purpose of liberally available limited liability. As too many small business people know, however, this limited liability is often more theoretical than practical. The liability shield is often porous. It has holes, especially for small companies, because individual entrepreneurs are often required to bind themselves to their company's contractual debts, often with personal guarantees. In that way, the circle of debt often returns to the individual entrepreneur, for whom a second chance discharge is the means of completing the circle of limited liability to protect those who take risks for the benefit of all of European society. Another effective benefit of a second chance policy is encouraging informal out-of-court workout agreements, something European policymakers have long desired. Business people have been legally supported in their efforts to seek composition arrangements with creditors for decades. But this mechanism has all too often failed to deliver relief. The money is just not available in several respects. Most businesses, and especially sole proprietors, cannot afford to hire the kinds of professional advisors whom we heard about in the previous roundtable. They have too little value to make offers that can capture the attention of creditors, and they lack the leverage of size and perhaps even limited liability to threaten creditors with a downside to ignoring them. So such small businesses need to rely on another source of incentive to convince their creditors to seriously consider a workout offer. They need a non-negotiated, law-imposed second chance discharge of debt. The World Bank completed 2 reports and recommendations on micro, small, and medium-sized business bankruptcy in recent years. UNCITRAL also recently completed a project on small and medium-sized businesses. Both of these reports endorse not only simplification of ordinary compromise negotiation procedures, but also a second vital step to leverage that negotiation process with a baseline guarantee of a second chance for individual debtors. A court or other authority should be empowered to impose a discharge of unpaid debt for honest but unfortunate debtors. This guaranteed backstop should determine in objective terms the debtor's reasonable ability to repay any portion of outstanding debt. The standard statutory compromise is a promise to pay creditors the next 3 years' disposable income. That is, all income beyond the ordinary and reasonable support needs of debtors, their families, and their businesses. The addition of this officially imposed discharge powerfully influences the preceding consensual plan negotiation process. The availability of an imposed non-negotiated discharge prevents creditors from holding out and pursuing the debtor personally for life. It marks the outside boundaries of the negotiation. This provides incentives for creditors to accept reasonable compromises and for debtors to offer what they reasonably have. In any case, the second chance discharge also provides a baseline measure of insured relief. Honest debtors will obtain a fresh start to be productive again, incentive to return to entrepreneurship to fuel ongoing economic activity, rather than being burdened and dissuaded by an inescapable debt overhang. Debtors need incentives because those who cannot enjoy the fruit of their labor will inevitably reduce or abandon their labor. Modern society cannot afford this loss. It is not the second chance procedure that deprives creditors of payment. It is the fact of the debtor's hopeless debt burden and financial distress, which will depress debtors' motivation without legal relief. Without a second chance discharge to offer an incentive for debtor productivity and engagement, the legal system sustains creditors' illusion that a legally established claim is an enforceable claim. This is practically true only if the debtor has incentives to be productive. But almost every debt enforcement system is completely unconcerned with the practical reality of the debtor's ultimate ability or inability to pay. The harsh reality of the situation is often that most creditors' right to payment are theoretical fantasies propped up by an elaborate, formalistic legal system that remains comfortably uninterested in practical reality. The second chance procedure effectively forces creditors to acknowledge that reality and agree to a reasonable compromise, stop burdening the court system and inhibiting the debtor from returning to economic consumption and entrepreneurial productivity for all of our society. Recent experience in the United States with the Small Business Reorganization Act proves this point. A surprisingly high and rising percentage of these small business reorganization cases has ended with a confirmed compromise plan, about 60% of which, 60% of which were consensual. That is, creditors agreed to these proposals. A significant portion of these consensual plans very likely have achieved confirmation only because creditors considered the alternative. Refusal to approve the debtor's proposed plan would likely result in court-imposed cram down, as we say, forcing the creditors to accept a future disposable income plan based on the court's assumptions and projections. Creditors very likely decided better for creditors to take their fate in their own hands rather than leaving it to a court. This statutory backstop alternative doubtless produces important pressure on the plan negotiation process, encouraging creditors and debtors voluntarily to seek reasonable compromises within the boundaries of an expected imposed arrangement. This raises the issue of the greatest concern for the effectiveness of second chance policy, the commonly expressed fear of fraud or dishonesty by debtors. The fact is, decades of experience around the world have shown that abuse and fraud by debtors is far less frequent than often suggested or suspected. It does happen, of course, But we cannot allow a few isolated cases of shocking abuse to stand in the way of needed relief for millions of honest small business people and even consumers. Volatile, globally connected economies mean lots of very real financial distress, especially in the wake of COVID-19. So we can be sure that most of the coming tidal wave of financial distress is real, and it's caused not by debtor fraud or dishonesty, but by pandemic shutdowns and general economic volatility. It is not constructive to treat every case as a likely instance of fraud and to offer a second chance only to debtors who can quiet that suspicion. A proper system of checks and balances is based on a presumption of an honest but unfortunate debtor, backed by the ability of creditors and system administrators to pursue evidence to the contrary, but not unfounded speculation or rumor. The best we can do is to put effective institutions in place: financial administrators, trustees, courts, to discover and punish abuse. We should not ignore it, but we should also not sacrifice the great good that second chance discharge relief can do simply because we cannot ensure perfect administration of that relief. Creditors have ways of discovering hidden assets, and if they do not accomplish this in insolvency proceedings, the ordinary debt collection system would not have discovered that value either. A second chance procedure is thus at least no worse than the alternative. Finally, the second chance is an effective policy, not only for increasing things we want, but for reducing things that we do not want. The threat of second chance discharge forces creditors to internalize negative external impacts of their highly profitable but highly risky lending and their unreasonable refusal to compromise with debtors. Creditors can no longer act with impunity in imposing the costs of their risky financial behavior onto debtors, their families, and society by stubbornly refusing reasonable compromises. Similarly, creditors directly profit from their greatly expanded lending, and a second chance procedure compels creditors to share those risks inherent in our modern, volatile, complex society, and to apply their far superior ability to assess risk when making lending decisions and their far greater capacity to absorb and fairly spread the risks of a downside. Analysts at the International Monetary Fund have repeatedly emphasized the macroeconomic benefits of a second chance procedure in reducing non-performing loans and removing legacy impediments to future consumption. In sum, an imposed second chance discharge compromise balances the burdens of inevitable financial failure on debtors, creditors, and society. This is especially true in the present day, where all of society is suffering from the effects of the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. Through no fault of their own, debtors of all types face ruin if their creditors cannot be convinced or forced to accept reasonable, value-preserving compromises. Such compromises or an imposed second chance discharge represent collective recognition that we are all in this together and we all must reasonably support each other. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Jason. We thank you for your intervention, for being so clear, and pointing out, bueno, por señalar los puntos claves del sistema de segunda oportunidad. No sé si hay alguna pregunta. Tenemos un pequeño margen. Si hay alguna pregunta de alguno de los asistentes. Yo, Jason, quería preguntarte, el sistema americano, en el modelo actual americano y el modelo europeo, en general con sus diferencias, pero Inglaterra, Alemania y otros países difieren el tratamiento del crédito público, ¿no? La posibilidad de exoneración del crédito público. No sé si nos puedes hacer una valoración de cómo ves esas diferencias y lo que aportan o no aportan a que el modelo sea eficiente, un poco en los términos que planteabas en tu intervención.
Dealing with public debt is a particular challenge. On the one hand, the idea of a second chance procedure is to allow the risks and the burdens of financial failure to be shared throughout society. And public debt already represents a sharing of burden around society. So in some countries, including in part my own, public debt often receives more favorable treatment in insolvency proceedings, and at least to some extent is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. On the other hand, as the World Bank in particular has recently expressed, it is sensible to recognize again that insolvency is about spreading the risk and the burden across society. So if creditors are expected to take on that risk and to allow it to be spread to them, then public creditors should behave exactly as private ones and accept that same burden, that same risk. The public creditor is even better situated to absorb and spread the risk of financial failure than private creditors are. So on the other hand, it makes very good sense for public creditors to play their part in an insolvency process and accept the very same discharge of their claims as private creditors recognize. So there's something to be said for both approaches. It seems to me fair to say, though, that particularly in Europe, the approach that seems to be more modern, that is growing in commonness, I guess, it seems to me to be more common for governments in Europe to recognize that we are all in this together. The government, if it is a creditor, should behave like other creditors do, and that public debt should not be treated any better than private debt. At the very least, because privileging public debt in that way has the very powerful potential to undermine the entire system. Particularly for small business people, public debt, back taxes, overpayments of public benefits often represents a very large segment of the debt that causes them problems. Failure of the government to compromise on those debts may well prohibit lots of small business people from obtaining the very kind of relief that these systems are designed to produce. So, if I were a government, I would think very carefully about both sides of the argument. But in the end, probably the better approach is the one that we seem to see more often in Europe, and that government creditors should be treated exactly the same as private creditors. And by the way, the incidence of public debt in the average personal insolvency case tends to be relatively small. For the few cases that involve public debt, those debts are sometimes very large, but there are few such cases. So it is not as though the government will suffer a tremendous loss if it simply allows its claims to be treated like all other private claims.
Sí, muchas gracias, profesor. Le quiero hacer una pregunta. En España es totalmente inhabitual que una entidad financiera solicite un plan de negocio a un emprendedor. Y mi pregunta primera es si en Estados Unidos es así también y si cree en este caso que es una manera premeditada y responsable de los acreedores bancarios para no esforzarse en prever el futuro de un negocio que puede ir mal desde el principio porque no se ha estudiado lo suficiente. Gracias.
Well, this sort of goes to the point that I made about creditors engaging in very risky lending. The fact of the matter seems to me to be, it is not responsible, it seems to me, for a creditor to lend to a small business person with no indication of that small business person's plans for the business. There should be some idea that this person's business will produce enough revenue to repay the debt. Lending in that way is and should be regarded as at least a bit irresponsible, but at the very least, it's risky. And one should observe the reason why a bank would be willing to lend on such a risky basis is because the bank realizes this small business person has no access to a full second chance discharge. If the person has that access, as I said in my presentation, the bank should think twice and be more careful about deciding to whom should loans be made and on what terms. Allowing banks to make loans where the risk is going to be displaced fully onto not only the debtor, but the debtor's family and all of society from losing that debtor's productivity if the inevitable failure happens is not a responsible way of participating in modern risky society.
Thank you, Jason. We have more questions.
Hi, Jason. I'm Matilde Cuena. Congratulations for your presentation. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to ask you some questions that you think I'm interested on impact of the discharge to create market. What are the problems that the entrepreneur finds when they want to apply to a loan after the entrepreneur got a discharge? Is the credit more expensive for him over there in the United States?
At least for a short time after obtaining a discharge, certainly credit will be extended on more expensive terms than before. It is a common fear that if someone goes into a second chance procedure, they will lose access to credit in the future entirely. This is not true. It is simply a matter of the credit being more expensive. And so that is something that a small business person or a consumer, for that matter, should keep in mind when considering a second chance discharge procedure. But it's not the end of the world. This is precisely the kind of compromise that I emphasized in my presentation. Yes, credit will remain available, but it will be more expensive, at least for some period of time. That expense is designed to compensate the creditor for the risk of lending to someone who might not be the best credit risk. But in collecting that money, creditors should recognize they've already been paid in advance for part of the risk that they're taking, lending to all of their debtors. And so allowing some of those people to receive relief from a second chance discharge is not the tremendous loss that many creditors would have us believe. They've already been paid in advance for many of the losses that this system supposedly produces.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? No. Pues agradecemos mucho, te agradecemos mucho, Jason, la oportunidad de escucharte, que haya sido tan pedagógico, y esperamos en la próxima podernos ver personalmente y que podamos seguir colaborando y compartiendo análisis como siempre estás dispuesto a ello.